Last Valentine's Day, I thought I was setting the table for a quiet dinner with my husband of 10 years. Instead, I found a love note that wasn't meant for me. By midnight, I realized I wasn't the only wife in his life, and before the week was over, I exposed the truth in a way he never saw coming. Valentine's Day had always been simple in our house. No grand gestures, no expensive jewelry, no rose petals scattered dramatically across the bed like something out of a cheap romance movie. Just dinner at home, a card, maybe chocolate-covered strawberries if he remembered to stop by the store. After 10 years of marriage, I didn't need spectacle. I needed stability. I needed the quiet assurance that the man I shared a mortgage, a bank account, and a decade of memories with was still choosing me every day. His name is Daniel Harper. If you looked up reliable husband in a dictionary, you might as well have found his face there. He was an accountant, structured, measured, predictable. He ironed his shirts on Sunday nights. He kept spreadsheets for vacation budgets. He remembered to rotate the tires on my car before I even noticed the tread thinning. That kind of man. Or at least, that's the man I thought I married. That afternoon, I came home early from work because my office closed at noon for the holiday. Daniel had texted me that he'd be working late to close out a client file. It didn't bother me. Tax season was always busy. I let myself into the house quietly, enjoying the rare stillness. The air smelled faintly of his cologne, cedar and something sharp. I smiled at that. Even now, that scent makes my stomach tighten, but at the time, it felt comforting. I set my purse down on the kitchen island and noticed his laptop bag on the chair. That was unusual. If he was working late, his bag would be with him. I told myself he must have run back home to grab something and forgotten it. I wasn't suspicious, not yet. I carried the bag toward his office to set it on the desk, and that's when a small red envelope slipped out and landed at my feet. It was thick, expensive paper, the kind that feels deliberate. My name wasn't on it. Instead, written in looping script across the front, were the words, "To my forever Valentine." My heart did something strange then. It didn't race, it didn't drop, it simply paused, like it was waiting for my brain to catch up. I told myself it was probably for me. Maybe he was trying to be romantic this year. Maybe he'd forgotten to address it properly. But when I opened it, my name wasn't inside. Thank you for giving me another beautiful year with our little girl. Watching you be her mother is the greatest gift of my life. I can't wait to hold you both tonight. I love you more than yesterday. Always, D. Our little girl. I read that line again, and again. The words didn't rearrange themselves into something sensible. They didn't morph into a misunderstanding. They stayed exactly what they were. I don't have a daughter. Daniel and I tried for children in our 3rd year of marriage. After 2 miscarriages and months of quiet grief, we stopped trying. He told me he was content with just us, that we were enough. I believed him because I needed to. My hands began to tremble so subtly that I barely noticed at first. I sat down in his office chair and read the note one more time, carefully this time, like I was auditing it the way he audited numbers. There were no ambiguities, no nicknames I recognized, no inside jokes I could twist into belonging to me. Hold you both tonight. Tonight. So this wasn't old. It wasn't a relic from before we met. It was current, immediate, scheduled. I looked at the date scribbled in the corner, February 14, today. I wish I could say I screamed, or cried, or shattered something against the wall, but what I felt instead was a cold, spreading clarity, like ice water pouring slowly through my veins. Daniel was a man of patterns, and if there was a note, there was a system. If there was a system, there were logistics, and if there were logistics, there were receipts. I stood up and walked calmly to our bedroom. His closet was immaculate as always, but now I noticed something I hadn't before. 2 empty hangers where a suit and a coat should be, a duffel bag missing from the shelf. I checked his dresser. The watch I bought him last Christmas was gone. He wasn't working late. He was going somewhere else. I sat on the edge of our bed and let the silence press in on me. 10 years. 10 years of anniversaries, shared holidays, hospital visits, inside jokes, and Sunday morning coffee rituals. 10 years of believing I was the only woman he came home to. And somewhere out there, apparently, was another home, another woman, a child. I didn't call him, not immediately. Instead, I did something very unlike me. I opened his desk drawer and found the folder labeled Investments. Inside were statements I'd seen before, and some I hadn't. A second mortgage, a property address I didn't recognize, payments made regularly for something called Harper Family Trust. Family. My last name is Harper too, but this trust wasn't ours. The beneficiary listed wasn't me. It was a little girl named Lily Harper. I stared at that name until it blurred. Lily, our little girl. The note wasn't poetic exaggeration. It was literal. I felt the first tear slide down my face then, not from hysteria, but from the sheer weight of the deception. This wasn't an affair that happened in hotel rooms or whispered text messages. This was infrastructure, a parallel life, real estate, legal documentation, a child who carried his name. My husband hadn't just cheated on me, he had duplicated me. I stood up slowly and walked back to the kitchen. I placed the Valentine note neatly on the island, smoothing the edges as if it were fragile evidence. Then I did what any accountant's wife would do when faced with irregularities. I began to gather proof. Bank statements, email printouts, the property address from the mortgage documents. I even found a separate phone tucked in the back of his sock drawer, powered off but fully charged. The man I thought was predictable had been running a double-entry ledger of his life, and tonight he planned to hold them. I looked at the clock. It was 4:17 p.m. If he thought I believed he was at the office until 9, then he assumed I wouldn't question his absence. That gave me time. Time to decide who I was going to be in this story. The sobbing wife who confronts him in private, begging for explanations, or the woman who audits the truth line by line until there's nowhere left for him to hide. I picked up my car keys, because if there was another household, I wanted to see it with my own eyes, not through paper, not through ink, but in real, undeniable flesh and brick and light. And as I locked the front door behind me, the red envelope still lying on the counter like a scar, I realized something terrifying and clarifying all at once. My marriage hadn't just cracked, it had been fictional for years. And tonight, I was going to read the final chapter. I drove to the address listed on the second mortgage with both hands steady on the steering wheel, even though my pulse felt like it was echoing in my ears. It was across town in a newer development Daniel and I had once joked was too suburban, too polished, too predictable. He had said it with that faint smirk of his, the one that made me think he preferred our older neighborhood with its mature trees and uneven sidewalks. Now I wondered if that comment had been a performance too. The GPS guided me through streets lined with identical mailboxes and freshly poured driveways, the kind of place where strollers were parked neatly in garages and porch lights glowed warm against white siding. It was almost poetic in its cruelty. He had built his second life somewhere immaculate. The house was a 2-story Craftsman with navy shutters and a wreath on the door, red and pink hearts intertwined in a tidy circle. I parked half a block away and turned off the engine. For a moment, I just sat there. The sun was dipping lower, casting long shadows across the lawns. I watched as a small tricycle lay on its side near the driveway, a pink one. My throat tightened. Then the front door opened. Daniel stepped out. He wasn't in his work suit. He was wearing dark jeans and the gray sweater I had given him for Christmas 3 years ago. He looked relaxed, lighter, like the version of him I used to see on Sunday mornings when he wasn't carrying the weight of spreadsheets and client calls. And behind him, stepping into the doorway, was a woman. She had long brown hair pulled into a loose ponytail and wore a soft cream cardigan. She smiled at him the way wives do when they believe they are safe. In her arms was a little girl, maybe 4 or 5 years old, with Daniel's dark hair and his unmistakable dimple when she laughed. He leaned down and kissed the child's forehead. Then he kissed the woman, not rushed, not secretive, familiar. My husband was not sneaking around. He was arriving home. I don't remember breathing during those few seconds. I felt suspended outside my body, like I was watching a documentary about someone else's collapse. He reached into the back seat of his car and pulled out a bouquet of red roses. The little girl clapped. The woman touched his cheek. I forced myself to memorize everything, the rhythm of their movements, the way the porch light flicked on automatically at dusk, the sound of the little girl's laughter carrying down the quiet street. When they went back inside, I didn't follow. I didn't storm up the walkway or pound on the door. I sat there, absorbing the logistics. This wasn't a fling. This was a coordinated, sustained domestic structure. He had integrated himself into 2 entirely separate ecosystems, 2 mortgages, 2 sets of utility bills, 2 grocery lists, 2 women who believed they were his only constant. And somehow, for years, he had managed the time. I thought about all the late nights during tax season, the weekend conferences, the out-of-town seminars. I had packed his suitcase sometimes, slipping little notes into the side pocket, telling him I missed him already. I wondered if he had ever found those notes when standing in that navy-shuttered house, reading them under the same roof where he tucked another woman into bed. The humiliation burned hotter than the grief. After 15 minutes, I started the car and drove away. Not because I was done, but because I had seen enough for one night. Confrontation without preparation would only serve him. Daniel thrived on composure. If I arrived hysterical, he would become calm. If I shouted, he would lower his voice. He would twist the narrative into something nuanced and complex and emotionally confusing. No, I needed clarity. When I got home, the house felt foreign. The couch we picked together, the framed photos from our 10th anniversary trip, I walked past them all like they belonged to strangers. I sat at the kitchen table and laid out everything I had gathered, the Valentine's note, the mortgage documents, the trust papers, the separate phone. I powered the phone on. It required a passcode. Of course it did. But Daniel was predictable in one crucial way. He believed in patterns, birthdays, anniversaries, repeated numerical sequences. I tried our wedding date first. It didn't work. I tried his birthday. Nothing. Then I hesitated. If he had a daughter named Lily, there would be a birthday attached to that name. I flipped back through the trust documents until I found it. Lily Harper, born June 3rd. The phone unlocked. I felt something inside me harden. The messages were organized with ruthless efficiency. There was one primary thread labeled simply M. The preview alone was enough to confirm everything. Can't wait for tonight. Lily's been asking when Daddy's coming. Daddy. I opened the thread and scrolled. Photos of the little girl at the park, videos of her blowing out birthday candles, selfies of Daniel in that same navy-shuttered living room, smiling like a man who had nothing to hide. Messages from the woman, M, thanking him for working so hard for us, discussing school applications, pediatrician appointments, paint colors for Lily's bedroom. My chest felt hollow. I had spent years grieving the children we never had, thinking fate had simply decided against us. Meanwhile, my husband had fathered a child with another woman and watched her grow in secret. I searched the phone for dates. The earliest messages went back 6 years. 6! That meant for more than half of our marriage, he had been dividing himself with clinical precision. There were calendar entries, too, coded but decipherable. Client D aligned perfectly with evenings I remembered him missing dinner. Seminar out of town corresponded with weekends I spent alone watching television, telling myself this was adulthood, that careers demanded sacrifice. Sacrifice. The word tasted bitter now. I placed the phone down carefully and stared at the wall. I realized something critical in that moment. This woman, M, likely believed she was the only wife. The messages contained no hints of secrecy from her side. She spoke of our future, of when we finally stop renting and buy something bigger together. She mentioned how grateful she was that Daniel had never wavered in his commitment to them. Never wavered. The audacity of it made my hands curl into fists. He hadn't just betrayed me, he had constructed 2 parallel narratives and maintained them with the discipline of a professional auditor. Separate finances, separate emotional scripts, separate holidays probably, staggered to avoid overlap. And tonight, on Valentine's Day, he had chosen to spend the evening there. I looked at the clock. It was 8:49 p.m. I imagined them finishing dinner. Maybe Lily is already in pajamas. Maybe Daniel is sitting at a different kitchen table, listening to another woman talk about her day, nodding with that attentive expression he had perfected. The grief finally hit me then, not sharp, but heavy. I pressed my palms against my eyes and let myself cry, not for the marriage I thought I had, but for the years I had unknowingly shared him, for the child who carried his last name while I sat in fertility clinics believing my body had failed him. When the tears slowed, something steadier took their place. Strategy. Daniel valued reputation. He built his career on trust. Clients handed him his financial lives because he projected integrity. If this remained private, he could spin it. He could plead confusion, claim emotional complexity, maybe even convince one of us to forgive him. But dual households are not just emotional betrayals. They are financial deceptions, legal liabilities, public risks. And I suddenly understood that the most devastating consequence for a man like Daniel was not a screaming match. It was exposure. Not reckless, vindictive chaos, calculated illumination. I gathered all documents and placed them back in neat stacks. I photographed the phone screen with my own phone, capturing messages, dates, images. I emailed copies to a secure account he didn't know existed. I wrote down the property address and began researching public records. If he could run 2 lives like a ledger, then I would audit him like one. And this time, I would not be the entry he could erase. I stood up from the table just as my own phone buzzed. A text from Daniel. "Working late, don't wait up. Love you." I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then I typed back, steady and polite. "Of course. Happy Valentine's Day." I set the phone down gently and allowed myself one final realization before heading to bed alone. He believed tonight was secure. He believed both of his worlds were intact. He had no idea that by this time next week, they would collide, and when they did, I would be ready. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm. For a moment, in that fragile space between sleep and consciousness, everything felt normal. The ceiling fan hummed, the early light filtered through the curtains. I reached across the bed out of habit. The sheets were cold. Then it all came back with surgical clarity. The note, the house, the little girl, the second phone. Daniel came home at 6:12 a.m. I heard the garage door open, the careful way he shut his car door, quiet, deliberate, as if he didn't want to wake me. I lay still, eyes closed, regulating my breathing. I wanted to observe him without his performance activated. He showered immediately. That struck me as interesting. Daniel usually showered before bed. This time he went straight to the bathroom as if he needed to rinse something off. Guilt? Perfume? Another household scent? When he slid into bed beside me, he hesitated for half a second before placing his hand on my waist. The gesture was familiar, practiced. "Morning," he whispered. I turned slowly, allowing my face to register sleepy softness. "You're home early." "Client dinner ran late," he replied easily. "I didn't want to wake you." His voice was steady, not rushed, not defensive. That was the most disturbing part. I studied his face in the dim light. The man I had trusted for 10 years was capable of looking directly into my eyes after spending Valentine's night with another woman and their child. "I left your card on the kitchen counter," I said gently. He smiled. "I saw it. Thank you." He didn't ask if I had seen his, because he believed I hadn't. We lay there for a few minutes in silence. His breathing eventually deepened as he drifted into sleep. I stayed awake, cataloging the texture of this moment, the absurdity of sharing a bed with someone whose entire existence had just split in two for me. By 8 a.m. he was up and dressed for work, back in his crisp navy suit. He kissed my cheek before leaving. "I'll be home at a normal time tonight," he said. "We can celebrate properly." Celebrate. I nodded and watched him walk out the door. The second his car disappeared down the street, I moved. The first step in dismantling a deception is documentation. The second is understanding leverage. I spent the morning cross-referencing bank transfers with property tax records. The Navy shuttered house was indeed in his name. Well, partially. Co-owned with a woman named Marissa Cole. Marissa. M. My hands hovered over the keyboard. I searched her name. Social media profiles surfaced quickly. She kept her accounts semi-public. There were photos of her and Lily at playgrounds, at pumpkin patches, at birthday parties. Daniel appeared in many of them, not tagged but present, standing slightly off-center, arm around Lily, hand resting possessively on Marissa. In captions, she referred to him as the most devoted father and my rock. My rock. I felt something inside me fracture again, but this time it wasn't shock, it was comprehension. She didn't know. There were no hints of secrecy, no coded language, no signs she believed she was sharing him. In fact, in one post from 2 years ago, she wrote, "Grateful for a man who chose us and never looked back." Never looked back. Which meant when he came home to me, he must have told her he was somewhere else entirely. Business trips? Extended audits? Did she think he traveled constantly for work? The symmetry of it was chilling. 2 women, both believing they were the primary household, both adjusting their lives around his professional obligations. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. Anger is easy. Strategy requires restraint. If I confronted him alone, he could manipulate the narrative. If I contacted Marissa impulsively, she might warn him. And Daniel, once cornered, would move quickly. Men like him always do. He would shift funds, secure assets, rewrite legal documents. No, I needed precision. That afternoon, I called our financial advisor and scheduled a routine review for later in the week. I also contacted a lawyer, not with accusations, but with hypotheticals. What protections does a spouse have in cases of concealed assets? I asked calmly. I did not use Daniel's name yet. I listened carefully as the attorney explained community property laws, potential fraud claims, and the legal implications of maintaining a second household. Documentation is critical, she said. I have it, I replied. That evening, Daniel came home at 6:03 p.m. on the dot. He carried a small box, chocolates. He kissed my cheek and asked about my day. I watched him move through our kitchen, comfortable, efficient, the same man who had stood in another doorway 24 hours ago holding roses for someone else. "We should take a trip this summer," he said casually while opening the fridge. I almost laughed at the audacity. "That sounds nice," I answered. He stepped behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist. I felt his breath against my neck. "You seem distant today," he murmured. There it was, the first flicker of suspicion. I turned in his arms and looked up at him. "Just tired." He studied my face for a moment longer than usual. I held his gaze steadily, let him see calm, let him feel secure. That night I lay awake beside him, planning the sequence of events. Exposure is most effective when timing is controlled. I needed both households aware simultaneously, no room for preemptive damage control. The opportunity presented itself 2 days later when Daniel mentioned an upcoming firm dinner, a semi-formal gathering with colleagues and select clients, spouses invited. "I put your name down," he said over breakfast. "It'll be good for us to show face." Show face. The irony almost choked me. "What day?" I asked lightly. "Friday." Perfect. A public setting, professional stakes, witnesses. After he left for work, I did something that shifted this from suspicion to inevitability. I drove back to the navy-shuttered house. This time I didn't park down the street. I walked up to the door and rang the bell. My heart pounded, but my posture remained straight. Marissa answered. Up close, she looked younger than me by a few years, tired in the way mothers of small children often are, but warm-eyed. Lily peeked behind her legs. "Hi," she said cautiously. "Hello," I replied. "My name is Claire Harper." The surname landed between us like a dropped glass. Her face faltered slightly. "I'm sorry?" "I believe we have something in common. We're both married to Daniel." Silence, the kind that rearranges reality. Her face drained of color. "That's not possible," she whispered. I held out my phone and showed her a photo, Daniel and me on our 10th anniversary last year, date stamped. "I'm not here to fight you," I said carefully. "I think we've both been misled." She stared at the screen, then at me, then at Lily. "My Daniel works late. He travels. He said his previous marriage ended years ago." Previous marriage. So that was his script for her. I felt a cold steadiness settle into my bones. I came home to him the night before last, after spending Valentine's Day here. Her knees seemed to weaken. I reached out instinctively to steady her, and for a brief, surreal second, we were two women holding each other upright because of the same man. "Does he know you're here?" she asked. "No," I answered, "and I'd prefer it stays that way until Friday." I explained the firm dinner, the public setting, the importance of confronting him where he could not twist the narrative privately. Marissa listened in stunned silence. "I think he deserves the truth revealed in the same space he built his reputation," I said gently. "Not in whispers, not in secret." She looked at Lily, who was oblivious, clutching a stuffed rabbit. "I need to protect my daughter," she said softly. "So do I, even if mine is only the life I thought I was building." We stood there for a long moment, two parallel lives finally intersecting. When I walked back to my car, I knew the collision was set. Daniel believed he was orchestrating 2 households with flawless timing, but on Friday night, in a room full of colleagues who trusted his integrity, both of his worlds would walk through the same door, and he would have nowhere left to divide himself. Friday arrived with an eerie calm that made everything feel almost ceremonial. Daniel was in an unusually good mood that morning. He hummed while knotting his tie, the faintest trace of satisfaction in the set of his shoulders. If he sensed anything shifting beneath him, he didn't show it. "You'll wear the emerald dress?" he asked casually, adjusting his cufflinks in the mirror. "It's professional but elegant." He liked presenting me as polished, composed, the supportive wife who fit neatly into the image of a trustworthy partner. I studied his reflection and wondered how many times he'd curated that same image in front of Marissa, only with softer sweaters and a different tone of voice. "The emerald dress," I confirmed. He smiled at me, pleased. By late afternoon, my phone buzzed once, a single message from Marissa: "We're ready." I stared at those 2 words for a long time. Ready. Not for revenge, not for spectacle, for truth. The firm dinner was held at a private event space downtown, all glass walls and dim lighting meant to imply exclusivity. When we arrived, Daniel's hand rested at the small of my back as we walked inside. The gesture felt possessive now, not affectionate. Colleagues greeted him warmly. "Daniel, glad you made it. Claire, you look lovely." I returned every smile with measured grace. My heart beat steadily, not wildly. This was no longer about shock. It was about structure. Daniel had built a false architecture around his life. Tonight, we would remove the beams. He guided me toward a cluster of partners near the bar. I noticed how often they praised his reliability, his discretion, his attention to detail. Discretion. If only they knew how far that trait extended. The room filled gradually. Laughter rose, glasses clinked. At 7:42 p.m., Daniel stepped away briefly to take what he claimed was a quick call. I watched him exit through the side doors, likely checking on the timing of his other world, unaware that it was already en route. At 7:49 p.m., the doors opened again. Marissa entered holding Lily's hand. She wore a simple navy dress, nothing dramatic, nothing provocative. She looked pale but resolute. Lily clutched her stuffed rabbit and scanned the unfamiliar room with wide eyes. The air shifted almost immediately. A few heads turned. Strangers always draw attention at private corporate events. Daniel re-entered from the patio at that exact moment. He saw them. I watched recognition strike his face in layers. First confusion, then disbelief, then a flicker of something close to fear. "Marissa?" he breathed. His voice carried just enough for the nearby group to pause. The room seemed to quiet without anyone understanding why. Marissa didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She simply walked forward until she stood directly across from him. "You told me you were divorced," she said evenly. The silence became absolute. Daniel's eyes darted to me, then back to her. His mind was calculating outcomes, searching for an escape route. He opened his mouth, but I stepped forward before he could assemble a narrative. "And you told me you were working late," I added calmly. Gasps rippled softly through the surrounding circle. A partner from his firm looked between us, confused. "Daniel?" he prompted. I reached into my clutch and removed the red Valentine's envelope, the same one that had fallen at my feet days earlier. "I found this in his bag," I said, holding it up just enough for those closest to see. "It thanks another woman for giving him a daughter." Marissa's grip tightened on Lily's hand. "Our daughter," she clarified quietly. The words landed with devastating clarity. Daniel's composure began to fracture. "This isn't the place," he muttered under his breath, stepping closer to me. "Claire, please." But it was exactly the place. "You maintained 2 households for 6 years," I continued, my voice steady but firm. "2 mortgages, 2 families, 2 completely separate versions of yourself." The managing partner of the firm stepped forward now, concern etched across his face. "Daniel, is this true?" Daniel looked cornered the first time since I'd known him. He tried to pivot. "It's complicated." "No, it's not," Marissa said softly. Lily looked up at him then. "Daddy?" she asked, confused by the tension. The sound of that word in that room shattered whatever illusion remained. Several colleagues exchanged glances. One of the firm's senior clients slowly set his glass down. I felt an unexpected grief, not for Daniel, but for the child standing in the center of a truth she couldn't yet comprehend. "I didn't come here to destroy you," I said to him quietly, though everyone could hear. "You did that yourself. I came here because secrecy is the only reason this lasted so long." Daniel's breathing quickened. "Claire, we can discuss this privately." "Privately is where you thrive," I replied. Marissa reached into her own bag and removed her phone. She opened a photo. Daniel at Lily's 5th birthday party, arm around Marissa, cake in front of them. "This was 3 months ago. You told me you were on a corporate retreat." A murmur moved through the room like wind through dry leaves. The managing partner's expression hardened. "Daniel, we need to speak. Now." He wasn't looking at Daniel as a friend anymore. He was assessing risk, liability, reputation, and that was the point. Daniel's eyes finally met mine fully. There was no charm left in them, no confidence, only exposure. "You could have just divorced me," I said quietly. "You could have chosen honesty. Instead, you built 2 realities and expected neither to collide." He had no answer. Security approached discreetly, uncertain but alert. The firm partner guided Daniel aside, their conversation urgent and hushed. Marissa stood beside me, her shoulders trembling slightly now that the confrontation had occurred. Lily leaned against her leg, overwhelmed. "I'm sorry," I whispered to her, not for exposing him, but for the shared devastation. She nodded faintly. I needed to know. Within minutes, Daniel was escorted out of the event, not forcibly, but firmly. His colleagues avoided eye contact as he passed. The reputation he had cultivated for over a decade dissolved in a single evening. I didn't feel victorious. I felt clear. As Marissa and I walked toward the exit together, one of the firm's partners approached me quietly. "Claire, if you need anything, please let us know." Professional language for, we had no idea. Outside, the night air felt cold and clean. Daniel stood near the curb, phone pressed to his ear, likely attempting damage control. He looked smaller somehow, less structured. The architecture of his double life had cracked under public scrutiny. He ended the call when he saw us. "You've ruined everything," he said hoarsely. "No," I replied evenly. Marissa didn't speak. She simply walked past him with Lily, who avoided looking at him altogether now. I paused in front of him for a final moment. "You divided your life like a ledger," I said quietly. "Tonight, the accounts reconciled." Then I turned and walked away. For the first time in days, my steps felt steady. Behind me, Daniel stood alone under the streetlight, no longer husband of one house or the other, just a man exposed by his own arithmetic. The silence in my house that night was different from the silence earlier in the week. Before, it had been heavy with disbelief. Now it was deliberate, clean. Daniel didn't come home. I wasn't surprised. By the time I changed out of the emerald dress and wiped the last traces of makeup from my face, my phone had already begun lighting up with messages. Some were from acquaintances who had attended the dinner. Others were from numbers I didn't recognize, likely colleagues who had obtained my contact information through firm directories. "Are you okay?" I had no idea. "I'm so sorry." I answered none of them. Around 11:30 p.m., Daniel finally called. I let it ring once before answering. His voice was stripped of polish. "Claire, we need to talk." "We did talk," I replied calmly, "in a room full of witnesses." That was humiliating. I almost admired the instinctive framing, not remorse, not accountability, humiliation. "Imagine how it felt to discover your child through a Valentine's card," I said quietly. He exhaled sharply. "You don't understand how complicated this became." "Then simplify it for me." There was a long pause. I could hear traffic in the background. He wasn't at the Navy-shuttered house either. Interesting. He said, "It started as a mistake, years ago, before we tried again for children." "We never tried again," I corrected him. "You told me you didn't want to put me through that." Silence. "Marissa got pregnant unexpectedly. I was going to tell you. I couldn't lose either of you." The entitlement of that statement settled over me like ash. "You didn't want to lose either of us," I repeated slowly, "so you chose to deceive both." "I provided for everyone," he said defensively. "No one went without." There it was, the accountant's justification, as if emotional betrayal could be offset by balanced financial sheets. "You treated marriage like a portfolio, diversified risk, multiple assets. That's not fair." "No," I agreed softly, "it isn't." Another pause, this one heavier. "What do you want?" he finally asked. The question hung in the air between us. For days, I'd been operating on clarity rather than reaction, but now that the confrontation was over, the practical aftermath began to take shape. Divorce, asset division, public consequences, and somewhere in the middle of that, a 5-year-old whose understanding of family had just been fractured. "I've already spoken to an attorney," I said evenly. His breath caught. "Claire, you concealed assets. You maintained a second residence under our shared financial structure. That has legal implications." "You're going to destroy me," he whispered. I closed my eyes for a moment. "You destroyed us. I'm simply refusing to carry the consequences alone." He didn't argue. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table again, the same place where the red envelope had first changed everything. I expected to feel rage. Instead, I felt something more unsettling. Relief. The uncertainty was gone, the guessing, the wondering, the slow erosion of trust I hadn't even realized was happening. Truth, even brutal truth, is solid ground. The next morning, news traveled faster than I anticipated. Daniel's firm placed him on administrative leave pending review. That language is corporate for "we are assessing the reputational damage." By midday, Marissa called. Her voice was quieter than before. "He came by this morning." "And?" "He admitted everything," she said. "Said he panicked when you showed up at the house." I let that sink in. Panic. Not guilt, not confession. "He asked me to give him time to fix it," she continued. "And what did you say?" There was a long exhale on the other end. "I told him I won't raise my daughter inside a lie." Her strength in that moment humbled me. "I filed for custody and support," she added. "I won't let Lily grow up thinking secrecy is love." The word love felt different now, less romantic, more structural. "I filed as well," I said. "Full financial disclosure." Another pause. "Do you hate me?" she asked suddenly. The question caught me off guard. "No," I answered honestly. "I don't." "I didn't know," she whispered. "I know." And I did. The evidence had shown it clearly. She had been living inside her own carefully curated narrative, 2 women both trusting the same architect. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "For what?" "For believing him." I almost smiled. We both did. After we hung up, I walked through the house slowly. The photographs on the wall felt like artifacts now, relics of a version of reality that no longer existed. I removed one frame from the hallway, Daniel and I on our wedding day, smiling with uncomplicated certainty. I didn't smash it. I set it gently in a drawer. Grief doesn't always demand destruction. Sometimes it demands reorganization. By the end of the week, Daniel attempted one more conversation in person. He stood in the living room, shoulders tense, as if waiting for judgment to be pronounced. "I never stopped caring about you," he said. The statement almost sounded sincere. "But you stopped respecting me," I replied. He rubbed his temples. "I thought I could manage it." "Manage it," I echoed, "like overlapping meetings?" He didn't answer. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked unsure of his own calculations. "I don't know who you are without structure," I told him quietly, "but I know who I am without you." That seemed to land harder than anything else I had said. He left with a small suitcase that evening, not angrily, not dramatically, just leaving. As the door closed behind him, I felt the final thread snap, not violently, but definitively. In the weeks that followed, consequences unfolded predictably. The firm's internal review became public knowledge within professional circles. Clients withdrew accounts. The managing partner distanced the organization from Daniel's personal misconduct. Reputation, once fractured, rarely returns to its original form. Marissa and I spoke occasionally, not as friends exactly, but as two women navigating the same storm from different shores. There was no rivalry left, only shared understanding. And somewhere within the legal paperwork, the financial audits, and the shifting of assets, I began to rediscover something unexpected: myself. Not the wife who balanced dinner schedules around late meetings, not the woman who internalized infertility as personal failure, not the quiet partner who accepted absence as ambition, but the version of me who could stand in a crowded room and speak truth without raising her voice. Daniel believed he was the only one capable of managing complexity. He was wrong, because while he divided his life in secret, I rebuilt mine in the open, and the difference between those two approaches would define everything that came next. Divorce is not a single event. It is an administrative dismantling, a slow, methodical disassembly of shared life into itemized components: furniture, accounts, retirement funds, emotional residue. The first official mediation session took place 3 weeks after the firm dinner. Daniel arrived 10 minutes early, which was typical. Even in collapse, he clung to punctuality. He wore a charcoal suit, slightly wrinkled at the sleeves, a small detail but noticeable. The man who once ironed obsessively now looked fractionally undone. I sat across the polished conference table from him, our attorneys on either side. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee and carpet cleaner, neutral territory. His lawyer began with procedural language: division of assets, disclosure statements, temporary support agreements. Daniel kept his eyes mostly on the table. Occasionally, he glanced at me as if searching for some sign of softness. He didn't find it. The financial disclosures were thorough because I had ensured they would be. The second mortgage, the trust in Lily's name, transfers between accounts. Even the cost of the roses he bought on Valentine's Day appeared in the ledger. Seeing it all, printed, line by line, stripped of romance and excuses, made it almost absurd. 6 years of deception reduced to columns and figures. There are discrepancies in several quarterly withdrawals, my attorney noted calmly. We will require clarification. Daniel cleared his throat. Those were business expenses. For which business? My attorney asked without inflection. The silence stretched. The mediator intervened gently, reminding everyone to remain constructive. Constructive, an interesting word for the demolition of a marriage. What struck me most during that session wasn't anger, it was Daniel's discomfort with exposure. In private, he had managed narratives. In this room, everything required documentation, evidence, signatures. He couldn't charm paperwork. After mediation, as we exited the building separately, he called my name. Claire. I paused, but did not step closer. I never meant to hurt you, he said. The sentence felt almost automatic, like something he had rehearsed. I meant to avoid consequences. Hurt was collateral. He flinched at that. For a moment, I saw the man I had married, the one who used to stay up late helping me assemble bookshelves or bring me tea when I couldn't sleep. But that memory no longer outweighed the architecture of lies he had maintained. I don't recognize my life anymore, he admitted quietly. I didn't recognize mine either. That's why this had to end. He nodded slowly, as if acknowledging a calculation he could no longer dispute. In the weeks that followed, practical changes began to solidify. I refinanced the house in my name alone. The bank representative, polite but curious, made no mention of the reason. Financial institutions care about numbers, not narratives. I repainted the bedroom. Not dramatically, just a softer shade, something that felt like air instead of weight. I removed the emerald dress from my closet and donated it, not because it held trauma, but because it belonged to a version of me that had been curated for appearances. Marissa and I met for coffee one afternoon without Lily present. It was the first time we had sat across from each other without crisis hanging directly overhead. She looked tired but steadier. "He's fighting for shared custody," she said, stirring her cup absently. "He will. Control feels like stability to him." She studied me. "Do you ever miss him?" The honesty of the question caught me off guard. "I miss who I thought he was, not who he turned out to be." She nodded slowly. "Lily keeps asking why Daddy doesn't sleep over anymore." The ache in her voice was different from mine. Mine was betrayal. Hers was disruption of a child's routine. "I won't interfere with your decisions," I said carefully, "but make sure whatever arrangement you agree to is transparent. No more half-truths." She gave a faint, humorless smile. "We've had enough of those." As we parted, I felt something unexpected again, not rivalry, not resentment, but solidarity. We both had been placed in narratives without our consent. Now we were writing our own. Meanwhile, Daniel's professional situation deteriorated steadily. The firm announced his resignation under mutual agreement. Clients continued withdrawing accounts. Reputation in finance is currency. Once trust fractures, recovery is slow and often incomplete. He texted me one evening, unprompted. "I never imagined it would unravel this way." I stared at the message for a long time before responding. "Truth always does," I wrote. There was no reply. One Sunday afternoon, about 2 months after Valentine's Day, I found myself reorganizing the garage. It was something Daniel used to do meticulously, labeling storage bins, categorizing tools. I moved methodically through the shelves, deciding what to keep and what to discard. At the back, I found an old box labeled Nursery. My breath caught. Inside were the small items we had purchased during our brief hope of parenthood: tiny socks, a pale yellow blanket, a stuffed bear. I had packed them away after the second miscarriage, unable to face them. For years, I believed that grief was a private failure, that my body had somehow disappointed him. Now, standing in the quiet garage, I understood the distortion of that belief. He had already been creating another life elsewhere while I mourned. I sat on the concrete floor and held the small blanket in my hands. I expected bitterness. Instead, I felt release.
The child I never had was not replaced by the one he secretly fathered. They were separate realities, one born of hope, the other of deception. I folded the blanket carefully and placed it back in the box, not as a symbol of loss, but part of my story, not erased, not weaponized, just acknowledged. Later that evening, Daniel came by to collect the last of his belongings. We stood in the entryway, the space between us no longer charged, but settled. He said he was moving into an apartment, small. I nodded. He said, "I thought I could compartmentalize everything, but it's like once the walls came down, there was nothing holding it up." "That's because the walls were the lie," I replied gently. He looked at me then, truly looked at me, without performance. "You seem calmer," he said. "I am," I answered. And I was. Not because the pain had vanished, but because confusion had. Betrayal thrives in ambiguity. Clarity dissolves it. When he left for the final time, I locked the door and leaned against it, breathing in the quiet. The house felt different now, not emptier, but more honest. In the months that followed, I rebuilt slowly. Therapy, long walks, reconnecting with friends I had unintentionally sidelined during years of adjusting to Daniel's busy seasons. I even returned to a hobby I had abandoned, painting. The first canvas I completed wasn't elaborate, just layered colors, deep blues intersecting with sharp white lines, structure meeting fracture. I realized something as I stepped back from it. Daniel had lived a double life because he believed he could sustain complexity through control. But control without integrity is fragile. It requires constant maintenance, constant deception. Truth, on the other hand, requires nothing but courage. And courage, I had discovered, grows quietly in the spaces where illusion once lived. By the 4th month after Valentine's Day, the legal process had moved from shock to settlement. Paperwork replaced confrontation. Numbers replaced accusations. The emotional explosion had already happened in that glass-walled event space. What remained was structural correction. Daniel's apartment was on the other side of town, small, functional, temporary. I only knew because one afternoon he asked if he could come by to discuss final details before signing the last agreement. His voice over the phone carried something I hadn't heard before: uncertainty. He arrived without a tie, without the polished exterior he used to wear like armor. He looked thinner, not dramatically, but enough that the edges of him seemed less certain. We sat at the dining table, my dining table now. The mediation documents lay between us. "I am agreeing to the asset division as outlined," he said, tapping the paper lightly. "Full disclosure, no contest." I studied him carefully. "Why?" He let out a breath. "Because fighting it would mean pretending I didn't do what I did." There was no self-pity in his tone, just fatigue. "And?" I prompted. "And I'm tired of pretending." The words landed softly, but they carried weight. For 6 years, he had lived in constant calibration, managing alibis, schedules, emotional expectations. That kind of double-entry life demands relentless vigilance. I could see now how it had hollowed him out. "You should have been tired long before you were exposed," I said quietly. He nodded. "I know." We sat in silence for a moment, the kind that doesn't demand filling. "Marissa's moving closer to her parents," he added. "She wants stability for Lily." I absorbed that. That's wise. He'll have scheduled visitation, structured, transparent. There was an almost ironic emphasis on that last word. "Transparency would have saved you," I said calmly. "I know," he repeated. He signed the final page. The sound of pen on paper felt definitive, not dramatic, not loud, just conclusive. As he stood to leave, he hesitated. "I did love you." I met his eyes. "You loved the comfort of me." The distinction mattered. He didn't argue. After he left, I felt something unexpected again. Not triumph, not devastation. Closure. Not because everything was healed, but because the narrative was complete. There were no unanswered questions, no lingering mysteries. And yet, something remained unfinished. A week later, Marissa called. "There's a school event for Lily," she said carefully. "Father-daughter night. He asked if I'd be there too." I listened. I don't want her growing up thinking women are interchangeable, but I also don't want to create tension in front of her. I understood what she was really asking. "Do you want me there?" I asked. There was a pause. "Yes," she admitted. "Not as his wife, not as anything, just as someone who knows the truth." The request surprised me, not because it was unreasonable, but because it required a level of emotional maturity that few people reach after betrayal. I considered it carefully. The old version of me might have refused, might have insisted on distance, but this wasn't about Daniel. It was about the child who had been unknowingly placed at the intersection of deception. "I'll come," I said finally. The school auditorium was decorated with paper hearts and construction paper crafts. Children ran around excitedly, tugging at their father's sleeves. The simplicity of it contrasted sharply with the complexity that had brought us there. Daniel stood near the entrance when we arrived. He was startled when he saw me beside Marissa. "I didn't expect," he began. "I know," I said calmly. Lily approached shyly. She had grown a little since Valentine's Day. Children always do. Growth doesn't wait for adult mistakes to resolve. "Hi," she said softly to me. "Hi, Lily," I replied gently. There was no bitterness in my voice. She didn't deserve any. Throughout the evening, Daniel moved carefully, attentive, restrained, no overlapping gestures, no blurred lines. Marissa and I remained polite but distant from him, united more by clarity than emotion. At one point, Lily tugged on Daniel's sleeve. "Why don't you live with Mommy anymore?" she asked, loud enough for us to hear. The room didn't go silent this time, but our small corner of it did. Daniel crouched to her level. For once, he didn't look toward either of us for guidance. "Because I made mistakes," he said slowly, "and sometimes when grown-ups make mistakes, they have to fix them by living differently." It wasn't a full confession, but it wasn't a lie either. Lily considered that, then nodded in the way children do when they accept incomplete explanations. After the event, as families filtered out into the cool evening air, Marissa turned to me. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For not making it harder." I thought about that. Harder. I could have made it harder. Public bitterness, legal warfare, social media exposés. But what would that have built? Destruction is easy. Reconstruction is deliberate. I'm not interested in punishing him anymore. The truth already did that. And it had. Daniel's career was in flux. His social circle had thinned. His carefully balanced image had collapsed. But more importantly, he had lost the illusion of control. And for a man like him, that was the deepest consequence. As I drove home that night, I reflected on the strange evolution of the past months. The Valentine's note had shattered a decade of stability. It exposed not just infidelity, but duplication, a second household maintained with precision. But what it also exposed was something inside me I hadn't known existed. Composure under collapse, strategic clarity instead of chaos, the ability to confront betrayal without becoming consumed by it. When I reached my driveway, I sat in the car for a moment before going inside. The house felt settled now, not haunted by what had happened, but redefined by it. And as I unlocked the door, I realized something profound. Daniel believed he could live two lives because he thought truth was negotiable. It isn't. Truth waits. It gathers evidence quietly, and when it arrives, it does not scream. It stands in the center of the room and lets everything else unravel around it. I walked into my home, closed the door behind me, and felt a sense of finality settle over my shoulders. But there was still one more thing to say, one final piece of this story that mattered more than the betrayal itself.
There is a particular kind of quiet that follows exposure. It isn't the stunned silence of discovery. It's the settled stillness that comes after everything has been named out loud. That is the quiet I live in now. Nearly a year has passed since the Valentine's note fell from Daniel's bag and split my life in two. The legal process is complete. The house is mine. His name has been removed from the mortgage, from the mailbox, from the narrative of my daily routines. The divorce decree sits in a slim folder in my filing cabinet, labeled neatly, not dramatically. I don't revisit it often. The firm he once worked for replaced him within months. Reputation, I learned, has a short memory when money is involved. But within certain circles, his story lingers. Not because I told it repeatedly, but because it unfolded publicly. Integrity, once questioned, leaves a faint outline that never quite fades. Daniel sees Lily regularly, structured visits, transparent schedules. Marissa moved closer to her family, just as she said she would. We don't speak weekly anymore, but when we do, it's direct and respectful. There is no bitterness between us, just a shared understanding of how easily trust can be misused. And me? I have rebuilt in ways I didn't anticipate. The first few months after everything ended were practical. Therapy sessions where I learned to separate my identity from my marriage. Financial planning meetings where I reviewed investments that once felt abstract but now felt like tools of autonomy. Long evenings where I sat alone at the kitchen table and allowed grief to move through me without trying to analyze it. Grief is strange. It doesn't always arrive as sobbing. Sometimes it arrives as a sudden memory. Daniel laughing at a joke only we understood. A Sunday morning ritual. A vacation photo where everything appeared intact. But I learned something important in those moments. Missing what you thought you had is not the same as wanting it back. The man I loved existed. He wasn't entirely fictional, but he was incomplete, compartmentalized, and that version of him could never have sustained the life I believed we were building. One afternoon, about 6 months after the divorce finalized, Daniel asked if we could meet for coffee. Not to renegotiate anything, not to revisit old wounds, just to talk. I agreed. We met at a neutral cafe halfway between our homes. He looked steadier than before, still changed but less disoriented. "I've been in therapy," he said after we sat down. I nodded. "That's good. I'm trying to understand why I thought I could live like that, why I believed I deserved both." It was the first time he had framed it as entitlement instead of complexity. "What have you learned?" I asked. He hesitated. That I was afraid of being alone, and instead of choosing honestly, I chose control. The admission felt genuine. "Control isn't connection," I said quietly. "No," he agreed. "It's fear dressed up as stability." We didn't linger on the past. There was no point. But as we parted, I realized something unexpected. I didn't hate him. Hatred requires energy, and I no longer needed to spend mine that way. Forgiveness for me meant no reconciliation. It meant release. It meant no longer carrying the weight of his deception as if it defined my worth. Because it didn't. For years, I believed my value in our marriage was tied to how well I supported him, how flexible I was during busy seasons, how gracefully I handled disappointment. When we struggled to have children, I internalized it as failure. I thought if I were different, healthier, more patient, less demanding, he would feel complete.
But his double life had nothing to do with my inadequacy. It had everything to do with his avoidance. That realization was the true turning point. Not the public exposure, not the divorce decree, not the legal victories. The moment I understood that betrayal says more about the betrayer than the betrayed. I've started hosting small dinners now. Nothing elaborate, just friends gathered around the same table where I once sorted through evidence. We talk openly. We laugh loudly. The house feels lived in again, not curated, not balanced for someone else's comfort. I repainted the front door a deep blue, a small change, but symbolic. It feels like my entrance now. Sometimes on quiet evenings, I think back to that red Valentine's envelope, the weight of it in my hands, the way a single sentence, "our little girl," rearranged my reality. At the time, it felt like destruction. Now I see it differently. It was revelation. It forced me to confront not only his deception, but my own complacency, the ways I had minimized my instincts, the subtle inconsistencies I ignored because stability felt safer than questions. I don't blame myself for trusting him. Trust is not foolish. It is necessary. But I do honor the lesson. Love without transparency is not love. It is performance. Commitment without integrity is not security. It is illusion. And dignity is not something someone else grants you. It is something you reclaim when truth demands it. A few weeks ago, I received a small envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a simple card. No hearts, no elaborate script. It read, "I am sorry for the life I divided. You deserved honesty." It was unsigned, but I knew. I held it for a long moment before placing it in a drawer, not with anger, not with longing, just acknowledgement. An apology does not rewrite history, but it confirms awareness. And awareness is where growth begins. If you're listening to my story because something in it feels familiar, because you've sensed cracks in a foundation you worked hard to build, let me tell you this. Pay attention to clarity. Do not rush to chaos. Do not rush to denial. Gather truth. Stand in it. Let it guide you instead of fear. Exposure is painful, but secrecy is corrosive. The night I stood in that glass-walled room and spoke calmly instead of screaming, I wasn't trying to destroy a man. I was trying to restore myself. And that made all the difference. I no longer measure my life in anniversaries or shared rituals. I measure it in integrity, in how aligned my reality feels with what is spoken out loud. Tonight, as I sit at this table alone, there is no Valentine's dinner waiting, no roses, no performance of romance. There is simply peace. And after everything, I have learned this. A double life can look stable for years, but the truth only needs one open envelope to begin undoing it. And when it does, you will discover exactly who you are when illusion falls away. I discovered I am stronger than secrecy, and that is more than enough.